So welcome to another session under our Industry Ecology Series. I'm very delighted to have all of you join us for day 2 as we continue explaining and exploring how sustainability and innovation can shape the way industries, communities, and individuals interact with the environment. Me who's speaking to you, my name is Diane Mumararungu. I work with ShareScreen Africa. I'm part of the team and I'm based here in Rwanda. When we talk about circular future, we are talking about a world where waste becomes a resource, where materials are reused, repaired, and regenerated instead of being thrown away. Because every product we save from becoming a waste, coming from a waste also protects the ecosystem we depend on, protects our mother nature. And here are the key learning outcomes that we are at the end of this session we'll be able to. The first one is understanding the broader sustainability context, including the SDGs, climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource challenges. Secondly, explain how industrial development can serve as a catalyst for sustainable and inclusive growth. And thirdly, describe the concept and purpose of eco-industrial parks and sustainable industrial areas. Fourthly, we have identified the main elements and practical consideration of sustainable industrial development. And lastly, we have recognized the importance of a system approach in addressing sustainability challenges and coordinating industrial initiatives. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest of honor. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Bent Ullman. And I want to apologize to him if I pronounce his name incorrectly. I really apologize, sir. But he is a senior program manager at the National Cleaner Production Center South Africa, where he leads the Eco-Industrial Parks program, a national initiative supporting just transition to a circular economy. And what is truly special about Bent is his systemic approach. He works across fields like energy, water, policy, and innovation, always with a focus on restoring both people and creation to their purpose. His vision goes beyond technology. It's about transforming how we think, how we work, and live together for a sustainable future. So without further ado, I welcome you, Bent. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Deanne. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for allowing me an opportunity to speak a bit about stuff that I'm passionate about, or at least one topic that I'm passionate about. I will take you through a long presentation, but we're not going to stand still on each of those slides. I've always found it useful if there are a couple of extra slides in the presentation that one can go back to. Especially if it triggers something in your mind, then you can go and have a look at that afterwards. Like I said, there's way too many slides to talk about, but the idea is that it helps you, to form a good idea of, what sustainable industrial development is about. Okay, so today's session this afternoon, I'm just want to check my time. I'm going to give you a bit of a context. I think you have already had a bit of a context from the speaker you had on Monday, which is a colleague of mine, Zubaida. And then, as was outlined earlier, just now, these are the key areas that I'm going to touch on. I'm going to look at industrial development as a catalyst, the concepts of eco-industrial parks and sustainable industrial areas. What does sustainable industrial development entail? I think that becomes more closer to what the topic is about, the need for a systems approach, and then, of course, examples. Okay, so I really want to get to the examples. I understand you've already spent quite a bit of time on sustainability and what that means. So forgive me if I skip some of these slides. I think it will probably reinforce what you understand. What I wanted to do with this slide, what is important to understand when we talk about sustainable industrial development is that there are all these different aspects that have a part to play. Okay, that means that you can't look at sustainable industrial development from a perspective of only supporting industry, let's say, in terms of trade regulations, for example. Okay. Or you can't only look at something from a circular economy perspective, for example. You have to take all of these things that I've listed here and play. I'm sure you can maybe even add more, but these are probably the most important ones. All of these have a role to play in this context. Okay, now I'm quickly going to touch on some of these. Dwindling resources. I think you might have heard of the International Resource Panel. It's an international organization constituted of a number of really great experts all over the world. And what they do is they look at the level of resource extraction of the planet. And maybe just one point I want to make about resources, okay, because this is actually really important from an industrial development perspective. If you look at the planet, we all know that the planet doesn't have a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth planet somewhere, okay? It's one planet, okay? So if you look at this from a thermodynamics perspective, it means that if you have so many resources, at some point, those resources are going to be used up for whatever it is that you use them for, okay? In a thermodynamics environment, usually this relates back to an energy cycle, okay? So you have fuel that burns, and when the fuel is used up, the fire goes out, okay? It's that kind of simple principle. I think everybody gets that, okay? Now, if you take the planet as being the fuel and humanity as being the fire, okay, I'm worried where this is going. I think some people might catch a fright. When the planet is used up, humanity has no more ability to continue. That's about as scary as it can get, right? Okay, so the point here is there are only so many resources on the planet, and we're actually already reaching a stage where some of the minerals that are being mined at this point in time will probably reach end of life in the next 50 years. So what do we do after? Okay, and maybe a question I can leave for you, maybe after today's session to discuss is, if we have no more iron ore that we can mine, how are we going to make steel to build bridges and large structures? Okay, that's what this means. Okay, so when you talk about dwindling resources, that's what it is about. Okay, so just a key message here I want to leave for you is really, we cannot continue doing things the way we have always done. That's why the circular economy and sustainability and all these things are important. Okay, right, let's move right on. So greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, I'm sure you've had more than enough on this, so forgive me, I'm just going to skip through these slides. I think what is important maybe is a slide that I'm going to come to. Typically for Southern Africa, and that includes most of the SADC countries, a typical global average temperature increase of 2 degrees is projected to translate to a 4 to 6 degree increase in Southern Africa. This is a serious impact on agriculture, okay? But it also has then a serious impact on water availability, and most industrial processes need water. So if you talk about sustainable industrial development, this means we have to start thinking about, okay, how are we going to recycle water? How can we reuse water? Can we improve our processes to use less water? Okay. Biodiversity, I just thought I'd stand still on this slide. There's a whole bunch of links that you can go and click on. So biodiversity, again, is a major factor in sustainable industrial development. Now, you might ask why. Now, it's actually quite simple. In existing industrial areas all over the world, countries are moving back to a model where people actually live where they work. If we go 200 years back in the development of humanity and countries all over the world, we had something called the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure you've heard of that, okay? Accompanying the Industrial Revolution was, a lot of pollution, what we call smokestacks. So you had these factories with all these little smokestacks, out of which came horrible emissions, okay? Over time, luckily, industrial production has improved. So now we have, apart from the heavy industrial areas, most industrial production takes place in a fairly clean environment. And what I've seen in a number of countries all over the world already is that people actually now design industrial spaces to be human friendly. So there's paths for walking and little wetlands and little streams, and places where birds can come and make their nest and things like that. So what you want is you want to regenerate what we have destroyed because of our industrial activity. Okay, so many people typically don't make this connection. I think, yeah, but industrial development is exclusive. So it means you cannot have industrial development and also protect biodiversity. What sustainable industrial development thinking hats do is it makes us understand that actually we can do both. Okay, enough about biodiversity. I'm going to skip this. You can read this at your leisure. I know you've learned about sustainability. So coming back to Marit's question there earlier, you will see that that first definition there, that's the generally accepted definition for sustainability. That's exactly what she asked. Okay, so crucial. All right. Again, I'm not going to stand still. I put together some additional links for you to go and visit if you haven't those already. I'm sure you've heard about the SDGs. I think Zubaida might have spoken about this on Monday as well, so forgive me for skipping that. Circular economy, again, I could probably talk the whole afternoon just about this slide, okay? But I understand that you have engaged on this and that you've been asked to look at this. Maybe something that might be useful is the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. It's called the R ladder. Okay, so it consists of 9 R's. In fact, I think there's now a 10th one that's been added. But this is important. So if you talk about circularity, which is very important in an industrial context, how can you apply these different R's into that process? Okay, again, not going to stand still on that. I think we're now getting more into the crux of things. So industrial spaces all over the world generally are accepted as being catalytic to socioeconomic development. Okay, this is based on the experience from the first industrial revolution. It's also based on research that people have done in terms of clustering of people, in other words, around cities, around industrial areas, etc. Always there's a very close link between industrial development and actually broader development. Okay. So hence the context of a catalyst, okay? I think what is important in that conversation as well is also to understand that you usually think about an industrial space as a production environment, right? So somebody sets up a factory, they produce something, that's usually what is associated with an industrial area. However, if one looks at the more successful industrial spaces all over the world, these are typically characterized by a lot more than just industrial production. Okay? Part of it was driven by the high level of pollution in especially heavy industry about 50 to 100 years ago. I might talk a bit about an example later on in Australia, which is a lovely example to go and look at. But where the surrounding community complained about the pollution, and then industry was forced to actually change how they engage with the community and what they do in that smaller region that they are active in. Okay, so they moved away from just production. Of course, production is still key. It's about the bottom line. It's about cash flow, all those kinds of things. But because the feeder areas for labor in these environments were from the local communities, it became important that there was outreach, that one started looking at different kind of projects and interventions to support the local community. And that way, the local community became a lot more supportive of the industrial activity, and you almost have a symbiosis. We call it industrial urban synergies, okay? But at a high level, a symbiosis between the community and the industrial area. Okay, so that's a different way of looking at symbiosis as well. Okay, I think a third one that is really in terms of catalysts that we talk about nowadays, especially the last 15 or 20 years, is decarbonization. I might touch a bit on that depending on how much time we have. The lovely thing about a decarbonizing factory environment is that you look at new processes, new kinds of products, new machinery, new skills, and there's a lot of opportunity for this. So the question is, how do you link this to the resources that are available in a particular area? whether they are, taken out of the ground, or whether you recycle or reuse or repurpose or remanufacture, whatever it is that you do. And how do you link this so that it feeds into local socio-economic development? Okay. I'm not going to talk about competitiveness right now. We might get back to that. Okay, so when you talk about sustainable industrial areas, I think a crucial concept that often comes up is that people ask about, well, what are eco-industrial parks? Okay, and eco-industrial parks generally are based on a definition that was put forward in 2001. In South Africa's case, for example, the same definition is used by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition for its industrial spaces, so in industrial parks and special economic zones. Okay. Which is actually quite nice because it means the alignment between sustainability and existing views or perspectives on industrial development is actually quite close. All right. Now, eco-industrial parks are also a bit more than that. Okay. It is about resource efficiency. Remember what I said about the planet being a limited resource. But it is also about cost competitiveness. Okay. So companies need to remain competitive. We are now all part of what we call a global village. Okay. 100 years ago, the world was not viewed as a global village. Okay. 100 years ago, people in different countries competed with each other, and there was no understanding of the planet as a village. Because there are now so many people, and we are so connected with, all kinds of technology, especially digital technology, we can effectively live on this planet with family being all over the world, and it's like we are actually in the same town. Okay. I mean, what we are doing here today, nobody dreamt of in 1980. Well, some of you weren't born yet. I was born in the 1980s, and I promise you, we did not have conversations about, oh, yeah, one day we'll have cameras and we'll talk to each other. Okay. I mean, this technology is amazing, and it removes distance. Okay. Unfortunately, what it doesn't do is it doesn't help us to have the human touch. So we lose a lot of the communication. And maybe this is just one point I want to make about this. I know this is not part of the presentation, but I kind of like stirring the pot sometimes. And we need to remember that we cannot rely only on digital technologies for the work that we do. It is about people. And 70% of our communication is non-verbal, which means that unless you see my body language and what I do, you miss a big part of the message. Okay? So if we only communicate with SMS or WhatsApp, for example, or email, it makes it really bad because that's like 10% of the message. Okay? So just a point about that. So yeah, eco-industrial parks. This is typically the definition that we are talking about. However, there's something else called sustainable industrial areas, which is a concept that was developed by the GIZ. So I've put in, some key pieces of information about what GIZ put forward about sustainable industrial areas. Now, I'm not going to read this. You can read this on your own time. The idea here was to give you a context. So sustainable industrial areas date back prior to when the concept of eco-industrial parks was born. Okay? And let me show you really what the two are in comparison to each other and how they link. Effectively, they are exactly the same concept. Okay? Sustainable industrial areas, like I say, are really the predecessor to what we call eco-industrial parks. The eco-industrial park concept was developed by GIZ, UNIDO, and the World Bank, and an international framework was first published only in 2017. A second version was subsequently published in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. And typically, if you think about sustainable industrial development, the International ERP framework is your go-to source. Okay, so a lot of what was done in the CR process of GIZ has been incorporated into the eco-industrial park framework. Okay, now again, I've given you a link here to that framework. It's a very nice document if you like reading, and if you have nothing to do between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, you can go and read that framework. It will give you some interesting bedtime reading. But you will recognize something immediately from this slide. And that is that we are here representing environmental, social, and economic performance. Now, if you remember what Maret just asked earlier in one of the questions was, what do the 3 Ps of sustainability stand for? People, profit, and planet. Okay, so you can recognize them right here. Okay, people for social, profit for economic, and planet for environmental. Okay, what the Eco-Industrial Park Framework also does, and this is really crucial for sustainable industrial development, is that you address the park management itself. So what that structure looks like, how it functions, how it provides services, how it links with the different companies, how does it engage with different stakeholders, all these kinds of things is absolutely crucial. Okay, so you can't just rely on 3 pillars of sustainability and say, okay, well, we pursue these 3 pillars, therefore we are an eco-industrial park, or we are pursuing sustainability. Sustainability is about a lot more than that. And I want to come back to a comment I made just a few minutes ago. All right. Humans, people are about contact, about engaging with each other. Okay. So if you want to plan an industrial space and you don't engage with people sufficiently at all levels of that planning and implementation, you set yourself up for failure. That's why park management becomes such an important pillar. All right. So there are 4 pillars in an eco-industrial park framework. The key components of an eco-industrial park. So looking at those 4 pillars, how do we address them? Okay, and we typically address them through 5 areas of work. This is adjustable, and this is a nice thing about the eco-industrial park framework. If you talk about sustainable industrial development, every country has a different context, right? People are different. Your resources are different. Your environment, your infrastructure, everything else is different. So you have to adjust to that particular context. And the nice thing about an eco-industrial park approach is you can tweak and you can improve on what is in the international framework. Now, these 5 things that we look at are just basically, like I said already, really park management, services, and governance. If there's time, I'll talk a bit more about this later. Resource efficient and cleaner production. I have a couple of slides about this to give you some more idea. I believe when Zubaida gave her session on Monday that she also touched on this. This is very close to life cycle management. But resource efficiency and cleaner production are central to a circular economy approach. Okay, anybody talking about circular economy cannot talk about circular economy application in an industrial space without addressing also RECP in short. Okay, that's what resource efficient and cleaner production stands for. Then, of course, the middle one, the blue one there, is called industrial and infrastructure synergies. So what we're talking about here is we want to leverage on the benefit of symbiosis. Okay, so one company has a certain waste product and it's used by another company as an input product. All right. So instead of it going to landfill, which we actually cannot continue doing as humanity all over the planet, all right, we really need to get away from dumping stuff on somewhere. Okay, because first of all, the problem with dumping is now it's out of your mind and you think, okay, problem is taken care of, while you are actually poisoning your own living environment. All right, long term. So what you want to do is you want to create as many synergies as possible between the companies in an industrial space. This takes effort. This is not a simple process. It is not easy, okay? But it is extremely rewarding when you can get it right. Okay, one of the examples later on I'll talk about, and I'm sure you've come across this, is Kalundborg in Sweden, which was actually, Denmark, which was actually designed from the word go around the synergies. That's very different from a lot of, maybe 99% of the industrial spaces all over the world. Most industrial spaces are brownfield, meaning they have existed for a while. So they're not new, and you have to work with what you have. And that really makes it challenging, but there's always opportunities to get more synergies. Synergies also exist between an industrial space and the local community, okay? So that could be between companies inside and outside the park, or between that region and the rest of the country, for example, etc. Okay, so I can probably talk a lot about this later on. I think the fourth one that is really important, and that is falling by the wayside in many industrial spaces still, even in South Africa, where we have very strong labor labor relations legislation, and occupational health and safety and occupational hygiene legislation. What is really important in an eco-industrial park is a healthy and integrated workforce. Integrated meaning that there are opportunities for men and women, okay, and that the opportunities are equal, right? I think a lot of people, have a big issue about this, and I totally agree. I think we need to give equal opportunities to both men and women, all right? While some men can do, well, or men can do some things better than women, and women can do some things better than men, that does not mean we should not be giving opportunities. Okay. And then the last one is about spatial planning and zoning. I think that's really crucial. So from a spatial planning perspective, for example, if you set up an industrial space, you don't want to put a heavy chemical plant next to a plant that has food production, so beverages, okay? Because if there's a chemical spillage, that food production company is going to have a loss. Okay, so you need to think about planning and zoning. Okay, right. Let's move on. There are a lot of benefits about an eco-industrial park approach. I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, you can read all of this and maybe discuss this with yourself. The international ERP framework has a number of objectives, I think, that are really crucial. Again, this is particular to the framework itself. So I don't want to bore you with the detail. I actually want to get to more hands-on examples. All right. So what does sustainable industrial development entail? Are we doing on time? Okay. I think what is important is to understand, first of all, what this animal is that is called industrial spaces. Regardless of where you are in the world, regardless of the kind of production processes you're involved with, regardless of the size of the industrial space or the local context, if you look at all the research and all the studies and all the papers and everything that's ever been written about industrial spaces, if you look at how they operate, you will find that all of these industrial spaces typically can be characterized according to this list of main characteristics. You can probably group them differently, but you will find that this is present in one shape or form in the most successful spaces in the world. Okay, so you need to have, in other words, let me quickly run you through here, because I think this is really important when you talk about sustainable industrial development. So a lot of countries have signed the Paris Agreement. Okay, I'm sure you know what the Paris Agreement is, right? And so they've committed to nationally determined contributions to reduce emissions. What most of these countries have not done is they have not connected that to what is required of industry. Just think a bit about that. So what's the point of committing as a country if you're not enabling industry and business to actually contribute, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, that is actually the situation. In South Africa, we have the same challenge, and I'm going to talk a bit about that quickly. So we've made commitments, but we've struggled. And I was in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition for about 10 years, where I ran this program. And we are not there yet where we enable industry to actually really make a marked difference in terms of sustainability. Okay, now if you want to reduce the carbon footprint, the water footprints of industrial spaces, just quickly, some of those acronyms I have: the EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility; EPC, Energy Performance Certificates; NDCs, I've already mentioned; SDGs, you're familiar with; ESG, okay, environmental and social governance. Okay, so this is important stuff. Okay, but if you don't enable industry to do it, they will not do it. Okay, it's just how it functions. So the regulatory and legal aspects are crucial. Okay, governance, management, and operational capacity of some kind of entity that manages the space. Whether this is, and I don't know what the situation is where you are, but in South Africa, we have a range or a spectrum of different types of industrial spaces. Some of them are privately owned. So it's a private property developer that develops the land, leases out buildings or builds buildings for companies. And companies don't own any of the property structures. And the bulk infrastructure is either provided by that developer or by the local municipality or town council. Okay, that's one model. There are many others. In many areas in South Africa, for example, these spaces are managed by the local municipality. but there's no team. Okay, so you might find that there are 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 industrial spaces falling under one person. Now, if you really want to be effective, you actually need a team of people to run a particular industrial space, not 10. Okay, so again, this is really important. Third one, systems and processes. You cannot run an industrial space ad hoc. Okay, in other words, you can't be reactive to what industry wants. You need to think ahead and plan ahead to be able to provide the right kind of service to industry so that industry can do what industry does best, and that is produce something, okay, or manufacture something or assemble something. You need to enable industry to do that, and you can only do that if you think ahead and put in place systems and processes that make it easy to provide certain services, to provide water, electricity, waste or materials collection, all those kinds of things. And we do that through what we call standard operating procedures or SOPs. Okay. The fourth one there is infrastructure. You cannot attract industry if you are not going to put down good road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, whatever kind of transport is needed, supply chain, logistics infrastructure, so warehousing, those kinds of things, cold storage if you need it, electricity, water, of course, sanitation, sewage and sanitation, stormwater drainage, all these kinds of things. If you don't put it in place, it will not work. And it applies to a sustainable industrial area even more than others. Why? Because we want to reuse our water. So there's a concept called net zero water. I didn't put the slide up on this. There's just not enough time. Okay, but net zero water is a key concept, just like net zero carbon is a key concept for sustainable industrial areas. Okay, so it becomes a lot more important to have good infrastructure and well-planned infrastructure. Skills development. There's no point you attract industry if you cannot supply a labor force that will work in that area. Okay, so it goes without saying. Supplier and small, medium enterprise development, or small, medium, and micro enterprise development. It is a well-known fact that small companies are very nimble and agile in attacking certain market niches. Now, if you enable them to set up operations through an incubator, entrepreneurial support services, or whatever it may be, what you're doing is you're laying the foundation of companies that can potentially grow into large companies. And that, together with a supply chain development perspective, is really important, especially nowadays, because a lot of the international trade is, especially if you export to Europe, for example, is just one example. They have something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I'm sure you've learned about that, CBAM. Now, that requires your supply chain to also start introducing certain circular economy or green practices. Okay, so if you don't address these things, you're not going to be competitive and you're probably going to struggle with your industrial space. Then next one, a key success factor. I'm standing still on this slide quite a bit because I think this is important to understand. Research, development, innovation, or RDI in short, are key success factors for industrial spaces all over the world. So there needs to be well-established links between universities, research institutions, specific research programs, even if they're funded by another entity, like, for example, the European Union or United Nations. Okay, it doesn't matter who funds it, but you need these initiatives because it enables industry to think a bit outside of the box and innovate and come up with new products and technology. Okay. Obviously, the next one is sustainability. I think that's crucial. I'm not going to separate that. But again, a success factor for a good industrial space is presence of sustainability. Shared services. Like I said, industrial spaces are not just about production. You might have shared testing facilities, laboratories, skills development centers. You might have a shared fourth industrial revolution technology center where people apply rapid prototyping, AI in product design, where they use virtual reality, augmented reality products. Those kinds of things generally are too expensive for one company or one entity. So what do? You pool resources and you share that service amongst the companies. Okay. It also provides an added income stream for an entity managing a space like that. Okay. The last 3 or 4, I'm not going to stand still on long. I think what is crucial, there needs to be some kind of ability or service to support industry for capitalization and financing and related support, as well as investment promotion and marketing. Okay. It is a big plus if you can assist companies with that. And again, nowadays, where the focus is on green products, it helps companies a lot to find these kind of technologies, products, conferences, exhibitions, whatever it may be. And if an entity that manages that space can provide that, it's a big plus for companies. And the two last ones, really about information sharing. So a successful industrial space always has some kind of advocacy, knowledge management, or awareness sharing process, and also has strong focus on quality management. Okay, enough of this. I think I'm going to lose you shortly. So I think we'll continue for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we can have a quick break. All right. Some challenges in the industrial spaces, especially if they're old, you might come across some of these. So I just put this up so that you know it's not all roses. Okay, there's a lot of thorns in there too. Okay, and you need to know how to deal with these things, and that's why sustainability becomes an important aspect. Okay, key aspects of a sustainable industrial development approach. I think, first of all, starts with the eco-industrial park framework. Secondly, you need to address climate change, emissions, decarbonization, all these kinds of things that I had in that slide up top when I started about the context. It needs to be part of planning, so it's not an add-on. Okay, so sustainability can never be an afterthought. It's a way of life. It's a different way of life to how humanity has lived for centuries. Okay, so we have to change that. It's about resource efficiency. I gave an alternative term there in case you haven't come across it. Sustainable consumption and production, or SCP, is the same as RCP. Okay, so don't get confused. I think it's pretty much the same. Sustainable industrial development needs to have industrial symbiosis and urban industrial synergies present. Okay, so you design for this. You have to be intentional about it. Having a policy that says we do this means nothing. Okay, and so it's not an academic exercise with, with all due respect to the academic environment. Okay, you need to be very practical about what you can do in that industrial space. Okay, so these things become really important if you are intentional about it and you really work towards it. Life cycle management, you had a session on that. Continuous improvement and quality management, again, sustainable industrial spaces or the eco-industrial park approach is all about continuous improvement. Okay, it's not about, okay, we're going to design it and then we forget about it and, everything's hunky-dory after that. It doesn't work like that. It's every single day, getting up, thinking about how can we improve? How can we make things better? Why? Because we compete with the rest of the world. And if you look at the Japanese and the Chinese and the Europeans and the Koreans, and I can go on and on and on and on, okay? We as Africa have to compete with them. How on earth do we compete if we do not have the same kind of intentionality of continuous improvement? Really crucial. Stakeholder management is the next one, okay? One of the key success factors, as far as I'm concerned, for any industrial space is stakeholder management. Okay. If you do not spend sufficient time on this, you can do everything else right, and it will still fail because it is about people. And then the last ones I'm not going to touch on. Let's move on. Maybe we can stop after the systems approach. So I put this slide together just to give you an idea of what are all these things involved in sustainable industrial development. And for many people, it becomes really difficult to focus, on the slide. What do I look at? How do I deal with this slide? Because it's too busy. And that was the intention. So you cannot address this without having a systems perspective. Here's another slide, again, showing you what all these aspects are to an industrial space. All right. Now, how do we deal with this complexity? Because this is really difficult, and a lot of people don't learn this. Okay, so we introduce something called systems theory or complexity theory. Okay, and this is a pet subject of mine, so that's also why I put in 1 or 2 extra slides for you. Okay, but what is important here is the definition. Okay, a system. Note what the definition is. A system is a group or combination of interrelated, interdependent, or interacting elements or components. interrelated, interdependent, or interacting. Forming a collective and complex whole that share a common purpose. I challenge you, go and have a look at how often people talk about systems, and then look at this definition. And you will find that most people talking about systems have no understanding of what this definition means. And that's why when we want to improve a system, we fail, because we don't understand actually what is a system. Okay. So in an industrial space, you have all these different activities, different role players that are interrelated, interdependent, and interacting. Okay. They form a collective. The collective is your sustainable industrial space or eco-industrial park. Okay. And it's a complex whole because each organization, entity, function has certain activities. So all of these things happen all the time. Okay. But there's a common purpose. And that is, it's an industrial space. So the focus is on industry. It's not on arts and crafts, on commerce or a residential area or sport or recreation. The focus is on industrial production. There's your common purpose. Okay. And in sustainable industrial spaces, it's about sustainability in industrial production. Okay. That's your common purpose. Now, if you want to make this work, you've got to look at it from that perspective. Systems thinking is just some kind of things that you can look at when you think about systems so that you can see what the difference is. Okay. So typically it's about these kinds of things. Again, I'm not going to stand still on this. Okay. There's really not enough time. All right. A systems approach really looks at these 4 key elements.
So now it's time for us to take any question from the student. And Mr. Wisdom, you could help us if we have some student in the classroom who would love to ask some questions. Perfect.
There's no question.
Okay. So from the look of things, there's no question. We can continue.